Before I before I read Dr. Pike's bio, I just want to provide a bit of background on this week's session and on how we even got to this week's topic and then the topic that's going to be coming up next week. So this week, our session 7 topic for 2025, Epidemics of Injustice, where our theme is disenfranchisement, fugitivity, and charting a path towards freedom. This week's topic is called Immigration as a Fugitive Activity. And our topic for next week, session 7, is called Shared Liberation as a Fugitive Activity. And as we were working together as a planning committee to plan for this 2025 semester, we really reflected on the importance of multiracial unity, of shared liberation, and we really wanted to make sure that we had a session focused on that. There are some folks in the planning committee who are very involved in sort of like work here in Chicago that's focused on multiracial unity. And a big conversation that often comes up in these conversations about multiracial unity is really drawing the links between conversations about policing. And people oftentimes are talking about immigration, and they're talking about like the prison industrial complex, right? And like we're having these conversations braided up in one another. But as we were planning for this session on shared liberation, we said, okay, like, hold on, we actually need to pump the brakes a bit and maybe take a step back because so many of us are steeped in a misunderstanding about the concept of immigration in and of itself. And so we felt like if we were going to have a conversation about shared liberation, we needed to actually take a step back and first really make sure that we questioned and sort of problematized this concept of immigration. So that's how we got to this conversation today. And I am excited about all of the sessions in E of I, but I would like to say that I'm like super excited about this week's session, about our speaker, and about the discussion that we're going to have following the lecture. So that being said, I'll introduce our speaker. So Naomi Paik is the author of Bans, Walls, Raids, Sanctuary, Understanding U.S. Immigration for the 21st Century, and Rightlessness, Testimony and Redress in U.S. Prison Camps since World War II, as well as articles, opinion pieces, and interviews in a range of academic and public-facing venues. Her next book-length project, Sanctuary for All, calls for the most capacious conception of sanctuary that brings together migrant and environmental justice. A member of the Radical History Review editorial collective, she has co-edited 4 special issues of the journal: Militarism and Capitalism, Radical Histories of Sanctuary, Policing, Justice, and the Radical Imagination, and Alternatives to the Anthropocene. She co-edits the Borderlands section of Public Books alongside Cat Ramirez, as well as the Politics of Sanctuary blog of the Smithsonian Institution with Sam Vong. She is an associate professor of criminology, law, and justice and global Asian studies at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and a member of the Sanctuary Campus Network, Sanctuary for All UIC, the Migration Scholars Collaborative, and faculty and staff for Justice in Palestine, UIC. Her research and teaching interests include critical ethnic studies, U.S. imperialism, U.S. militarism, social and cultural approaches to legal studies, transnational and women of color feminisms, abolition, carceral spaces, and labor, race, and migration. So Dr. Pike is going to begin this session with a lecture, and then we're going to get into some discussion. And then in the final 30 minutes of our class today, we're going to be joined by another person who is going to participate in our Q&A alongside Dr. Pike. And I'm actually going to read Dr. Nadine Neber's bio now as well, so that when she joins, she can just jump right in. So Dr. Nadine Neighbor is professor of the Gender and Women's Studies program and the Global Asian Studies program at the University of Illinois at Chicago and founder of Liberate Your Research workshops. She is co-author, co-editor of 5 books, including Arab America, Gender, Cultural Politics and Activism, and Arab American Feminisms. She is the recipient of major awards such as the 2022 Lifetime Achievement Prize from the American Studies Association, the 2002 YWCA's Y Women's Leadership Award, and the Marguerite Casey Foundation's Freedom Scholar Award. She serves on the boards of the Journal of Palestine Studies, the National Council for Arab Americans, and the Feminist Peace Initiative. She is co-founder of the Arab American Cultural Center and the Global Middle East Studies minor at UIC and the organization Mamas Activating Movements for Abolition and Solidarity. So as usual, I want to encourage you all to drop your comments and reflections in the chat as we listen. We're going to have time, like I said, towards the middle and into the end of our session to ask questions and really engage in some reflective discussion about all that we've heard today. So without further ado, Dr. Paik, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Ford. I just want to do a quick check. Can everyone hear me? The volume is okay? Okay, and I think the closed captions are enabled. So if people are hard of hearing, you can use the closed captions. I am, okay. I just sent a request to share my screen, if that could be, let's see. Okay, here we go. Okay, can y'all see this?
Yes.
Yes. I think we might see the wrong view though.
Okay. Hold on. How's this?
Yeah, we see your presenter slides.
Okay. Okay, great. Okay, well,
Or no, like your speaker slides, sorry.
oh shoot. Okay, how do I swap displays? I hate Zoom. Okay.
Yep, right there.
How about this?
Yep.
We good?
We're good. Thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, great. First of all, I want to thank Dr. Ford and Megan and Veronica for inviting me to your class. I'm really interested to learn more about the collaboration over the epidemics of injustice between radical public health and the UIC official registered course. I think this is a great model. I would love to bring something like this over to East Campus. Is that right? East Campus. Because I think building these community connections through the bread and butter of what we do, teaching, research, and community engagement, I think this is a wonderful model of it. So I really appreciate being here. I also really appreciate being here for your theme this year on fugitivity. And I was really heartened to know that you guys want to take immigration really seriously and also thinking about solidarity. So I'm going to be talking about all of those things in the next maybe like half hour. And then I'm hoping we can have like a really robust discussion about some of the things that that I raised. I also want to say, oh gosh, just hearing the bio, the Nation of Sanctuary blog posts from the Smithsonian have been taken down under the conditions that we're living under. So that's a thing I just found out yesterday when a random user asked me what had happened to it. So they're no longer on the website, but if you want to check them out, I do think I can get you archived copies of those. And I also put in the chat a recent article for Bloomberg that I wrote. It's a very short article that talks about the long history of migrant detention in Guantanamo. So I think that could also come into the discussion, though I'm not speaking about it explicitly in my comments today. Okay, so what I'm going to do, I think Dr. Ford in the class had you read a chapter or two from my last book, which is called Bans, Walls, Raids, Sanctuary. I actually wrote this book during the first Trump administration. It kind of rolled out organically because we started doing sanctuary campus work, and then people started asking me to talk about it. Why sanctuary? Why is this the thing? So I started writing about it. I wrote a bunch of talks, and then out of that came an article. I still felt like I had more things to say, so then I wrote this book. And I was like dead set on getting it out in 2020. So it came out in summer 2020 on the lead up to the election. I wish I had spent the last 4 years doing maybe something similar, but we can't go backwards. So anyhow, a lot of the arguments and the material, the evidence that I present in the book is still obviously very salient for today. The book focuses on U.S. immigration crises in the 21st century and radical sanctuary movements. So I'll spend a little bit of time just laying out some of the core arguments of the book, and then I'll move on from there to talk about what's happening right now. We are in a very different conjuncture than we were in 2017. Things have gotten much harder. Things are much worse than they were back then. And so I want to think about how did we get here? I seem to ask this every 8 years or so. And then think about what can we do about it. Okay, so let's get going. Okay, so I'll just give a real quick recap of the book. Okay, so I wrote this book in response to the ascendance of a white nationalist who climbed to the White House by demonizing migrants from colonized countries and quickly sought to fulfill his campaign promises by signing 3 executive orders within his first few days in office: the so-called Muslim ban, the US-Mexico border wall, and escalated interior enforcement via ICE raids. So each of the first 3 chapters, which I didn't have you read, but they're very short, so you can get it from the library. But each of the first 3 chapters starts with one of those executive orders and then traces their deep histories, reaching back to 2 foundational moments in US history. So the first are the settler colonial origins of the United States that sought to destroy the indigenous civilizations already here in order to replace them with a new permanent settler society rooted in a white racial identity, property ownership, and patriarchy. So as Kelly Lytle Hernandez argues, US settler colonium has sought to exclude racial others even as it exploits their labor. So obviously enslaved people, but also exploited migrant workers who have cycled through the United States, right? So it seeks to exclude racial others, even as it exploits their labor by, quote, deporting, hiding, or criminalizing them, or otherwise revoking the right of racialized outsiders to be within the invaded territory. So none of us really have a right to be here. Only white settlers do. So that's one kind of foundational framework and moment in which to understand immigration history. The second is that each chapter reaches back to the foundational emergence of federal immigration restrictions in the late 19th century, which have always been shaped by racism, capitalist labor exploitation, fears of disease and disability, and patriarchy, among other hierarchies of power, right? So I trace the history of xenophobic exclusions, detentions, and deportations of migrants considered undesirable. So I start from the 1875 Page Act that banned Chinese women and workers, and then eventually spreading to all of Asia. So we had generalized Asian exclusion, but it started based on race and class and gender, right? I also discuss the so-called tribal 20s, the most restrictive era of US immigration history. And this is the era that people like Jeff Sessions and Trump and who's the evil bald guy? I forget his name, but the one who's very anti-immigrant, they want to bring us back to the tribal 20s, okay? In this most restrictive era of US immigration history. So I focus on the creation of the Border Patrol in 1924, as well as the 1924 Johnson-Reed Act that sought to racially engineer a white populace and was considered the legislative achievement of the eugenics movement. And the image on the right is a Klan poster that was very much in support of the Johnson-Reed Act because they felt like it was uh, advancing their goal of building a white nation. And I examined how the ostensible dismantling of racial restrictions on immigration in 1965, in fact, led to the outsized criminalization of Mexican migrants as the paradigmatic illegal aliens by placing quotas on them for the first time, despite long-standing histories of labor migration. So I realize I'm skipping over a lot of history. If anyone needs clarification on this, I'm happy to go more in depth. Okay, so each chapter also kind of picks up speed. It kind of accelerates when we get to the era of neoliberalism, which not only displaced people both within and beyond the United States through policies encouraging capital flight, like free trade agreements that left working class people in places like Detroit behind, while compelling millions of other working class people to migrate across borders for their survival. The neoliberal era also showed how the state is, quote, built on prison foundations, dealing with the fallout of all of those surplus populations left behind by organized abandonment, by building a massive carceral state of organized violence, fueled by criminalization, policing, surveillance, and prisons, and targeting a vast swath of minoritized people, including non-citizens. So basically, much of my analysis is thinking through the evisceration of the social good and the rise of mass incarceration and mass criminalization of non-citizens together. So I really think that the kind of demonization, the criminalization of immigrants and the rise of the carceral state under neoliberalism have to be understood as of a piece with each other. They feed off of each other. And as Ruthie Gilmore indicates, in terms of where am I? Okay, sorry, I don't have that slide. Okay, so, and as Ruthie Gilmore indicates, in terms of solidarity, this also means that people who are documented not to work, the 65 million or more who have been through prison and have to check the box, have you ever been convicted of a crime? As well as those who are not documented to work, like undocumented immigrants, vulnerable to criminalization and deportation, have the power to make an enormous power base. So if all the people have cycled through the criminal legal system and have to check that box, combined forces with all of the undocumented workers or criminalized migrants in this country, you would be talking about half of the US workforce, right? So that's an incredible power base. And it's one that's still latent. It hasn't been tapped into, right? So the history of bans, walls, and raids brings together these vectors of power around race, gender, sexuality, national origin, religion, neurodiversity, and physical disability. So in the book, I also talk about how once the US started excluding people from immigration, it really got on a roll. So it starts with Chinese women and workers, but then it like expands very quickly, like actually within months, to people who are likely to become a public charge, i.e. widows, single women, poor people. It goes to physical and mental disabled people and people who are sick, and so on, right? So in other words, the state has long been making the connections for us. It already has an intersectional analysis, if from the dark side. So if we need to be at least as intersectional as the state is in targeting us. So the basic argument of the book is that the problem was never Donald Trump. The problem is the United States of America, right? And while 45's actions were not new, they made clearly visible the fundamental problems seething at the core of the United States. Okay, so then what were we supposed to do about it? So even as these interlocking oppressions we confront have deep roots, so too do the resistance movements against them. And so as Rod Ferguson states so beautifully, the past is not just the bad stuff that washes onto the shore. Historical and cultural riches also come in with the tide. So the history that I outline in the first three chapters show how multiple oppressions work together and thus demand multi-fronted struggles. So in the book's last chapter and the epilogue, I turn to an abolitionist approach to sanctuary as one way to help us not only defend communities right now, but also help us envision and build the future that we deserve. So I examined multiple movements and campaigns and strategies that offer models of this solidarity organizing that is required to confront the thickly entangled crises we face. And they indicate what an abolitionist sanctuary can look like. So the movements, these movements span the, sorry. Okay, so these movements span the sanctuary movement for Central American migrants during the 1980s and the new sanctuary movement of the 2000s against deportations, to the movement for Black lives, to ongoing campaigns that have brought migrant justice and abolitionist organizations together to combat racist policing, like eliminating gang databases. And the person to talk to about this is Andy Clarno at UIC, who did a lot of work around the Erase the Database campaign, along with UIC graduate students. Okay, so these movements innovate and draw on different strategies, many of them operating through the logic of non-reformist reform that unravel rather than expand the scope of oppressive powers, from know your rights and cop watching trainings to legal advocacy, to mutual aid networks, to divestment campaigns aimed at banks and businesses that finance prisons, warfare, and I would add now genocide, that supply migrant detention centers, and that sell user data to ICE and to the cops. I also look to experimental practices of restorative and transformative justice that ordinary people are using to grapple with violence without inviting the state. And with all these crisscrossing connections, the potential of an abolitionist approach to sanctuary may seem so kind of scattered and all over the place as to lose coherence. But that capaciousness is actually the point, right? So forces like racism, patriarchy, and capitalism work together and amplify each other's destructive effects. And as Nadine Naber argues, these oppressive powers make the connections for us. They require an analysis and host of strategies that can contend with their massive reach. And an abolitionist sanctuary, therefore, has to be bountiful because it struggles for a transformed world where everyone has the means to thrive in an actual world where so few do. Okay. So these campaigns draw on long and again, capacious histories of sanctuary and abolition. And I'm skipping over these histories for the sake of time. So again, if people want to kind of dig in more, please feel free to ask questions in the chat and I'll get to those. So how can an abolitionist approach to sanctuary bring together their ethics of giving refuge to the fugitive, their open defiance of the unjust laws of the state, their fostering of new relationships unbound by nation-state borders, and they're bringing into being a different world where the political order rooted in the oppression of others no longer exists. And while it might seem to combine two concepts that might not seem to align, it connects sanctuary's radical welcome and its judgment and free embrace of anyone to abolition, the social justice organizing that seeks to tear down oppressive power structures like prison systems and build a just, equitable world in their place, one in which we refuse to solve problems by resorting to violence or to create the illusion of safety for some by violating others. And what these movements share is a commitment to taking care of one another. An abolitionist sanctuary combines the community defense that is needed right now with the deep envisioning and building of a new society where we welcome all of our neighbors without exception. It is guided less by creating a space of safety for some, and instead it seeks to create a society where no one, regardless of citizenship, criminal record, poverty, ability, or any other factor, is discarded as if they are unworthy of economic means, affirming social relationships, or political power. And it strives for what is not yet here, even as it works under current conditions. Indeed, sanctuary's defense is necessary right now because we have not achieved the just society abolition aspires to create. And in fact, we've moved even further from that horizon. So that means that sanctuary practices are more important now than they really ever have been. So an abolitionist sanctuary thus operates in the time of what Stephen Best and Saidiya Hartman call fugitive justice, to get back to your theme, between the no longer and the not yet, between the destruction of the old world and the awaited hour of deliverance. So how might the unauthorized immigrants' position of fugitivity, their transgression of the proper, their disruption and disorder to the nation-state's sovereignty, how can that open up new possibilities of social life into what Fred Moten calls the fugitive being of infinite humanity? I have focused on the targeting of migrants and non-citizens in part because they are outsiders within whose oppression is normalized and justified by the political form of the nation state. Or, as Kelly Laddell Hernandez argues, immigration control is, quote, one of the least constitutional and most racist realms of governance in US law and US life. And this is why immigration has become so central to the Make America Great Again agenda. So I am just going to, okay, where am I? Okay, I'm just gonna blank this out for a little bit. Just to say, here we are again. And after taking a short break, I'm actually gonna stop sharing my slides. Hold on a second. Sorry, I hate Zoom and I'm on like 2 screens, so just bear with me. Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing now. But here we are again, and after getting a short break from round 1 of the Trump administration, punctuated and rounded out with a global pandemic that took millions of lives and compelled us to shelter in place, we are in a much worse position today than we were in February 2017. Okay, the terrain has really shifted, and in many obvious ways, we have lost so much ground. Okay, shrinking our base and our ability to build stalwart defenses and effective campaigns. And a lot of this shrinking ground has come from the betrayals and concessions of people who claim to defend liberal democracy. So, for example, the Democratic Party has fundamentally contributed to building the bloated structures of law and order politics, corporate power, and military violence that we are seeing mobilized by the current administration. In addition, our employers in higher education have colluded in the ceding of ground to neo-fascist forces, not only in its increasingly corporate structures that convert education into a product, students into customers, and workers into problems to be managed, but also and especially their crackdowns against pro-Palestine movements has harnessed all kinds of weapons, law and policy, policing, and even munitions to deploy against their own community members. So just in case you missed it, the 5 universities in the University of California system have requested munitions and surveillance drones from the US military excess to amplify their campus police forces. So I'm talking about stuff like that. So institutions ostensibly of learning, free inquiry, and knowledge production violently shut down learning, free inquiry, and knowledge production when it comes to Palestine. Many of us are not even allowed to make or sign statements, much less congregate on campus together. And having been commanded to shut up, we are unable to protest, convene in groups, or express solidarity with targeted communities at the very moment when resistance to the forces of neoliberal neo-fascism are more urgent than necessary than ever. And we're the ones who did this to ourselves. So this is what I mean when I say we have lost the very ground under our feet. It is no wonder that our institutions have backed themselves into a corner and now cannot mount a defense against, for example, the executive order to effect the deportations and visa denials to international scholars and students who express support for Palestine. We have so few allies in the halls of power, and we also do not have a choice but to work with them, even as they prove over and over and over that they cannot be trusted. Right? So where does that leave us? So as dire as things are, with a proposed US takeover of Gaza turning it into a resort, the shipping of imprisoned people to El Salvador's brutal prison regime, the migrant detention camps at Guantanamo, the ICE raids, the attacks on science and research, the efforts to eliminate trans people, the dismantling of education, the gutting of the FAA, the escalating robbing of the poor to enrich the already rich. Everything that we are seeing and experiencing did not come out of nowhere, and none of it is fully the consequence of Donald Trump taking the White House. And that fact alone means that there is always space to maneuver. Also, well, not all of us, those of us who are in Chicago, we get to live here. We get to live in Chicago where there is organizing and people on the ground helping each other survive, which means there are opportunities and avenues to jump in and help out everywhere you turn, right? So don't take that for granted. And even if some of you are logging in from more isolated places, more rural places, more hostile places, there are people around you who share your values. And it's just a matter of finding them and doing something together. It could be a potluck. It doesn't have to be big, right? But there are people who support you and who share your values around you, no matter where you are. Okay. So, yeah. So, but for the Chicago folks, don't take Chicago for granted, right? I've been in touch with a lot of folks who are in much more hostile and more isolated places where the conditions are a lot harder, but they're still organizing and they're still doing things. And if you're looking for somewhere to plug in, you know you want to do something, but you're not sure where to go, the Sanctuary for All UIC group is off the ground. And as a newly formed collective, we have been organizing teach-ins and webinars and meetings that seek to bring together UIC faculty, staff, students, and alumni, as well as community members. And our goal is to share resources, to organize ourselves, to keep each other safe, to advocate for targeted communities, and to insist that our university administration do everything possible to expand sanctuary protections at UIC for everyone. And everyone is welcome to join us and organize. And if you feel like you don't have experience or knowledge, A, that's not true. And B, the whole point is to learn from and help each other grow. Okay? And if you've got colleagues or homies elsewhere who are not at UIC, the Sanctuary Campus Network is also off the ground nationwide and is working to facilitate local organizing for sanctuary campuses across the United States. So we've been collecting and sharing resources and strategy to help distribute labor instead of duplicating it. And we are helping folks find each other by region, state, city, and university, which is especially helpful for those folks who are in more isolated or hostile states and rural areas. Okay? So one concrete example of the resource sharing that we're doing in the national network is Know Your Rights training. So we've been distributing a slide deck that can be adapted to different locations. And one of the things that we're working on is having the Immigrant Defense Project do a large Know Your Rights training for all of us, especially for those folks in more isolated or hostile locations where people just aren't really ready to host a Know Your Rights training, right? And, you know, in all of these groups, like I bring my abolitionist principles to this work, but I do not assume that everybody who's showing up shares my politics, my goals, or that any of us are going to agree on strategy. But I think what's bringing us together is the unavoidable necessity that we work together. We are not going to get through this alone. And that means fundamentally working across differences and in solidarity just to buy ourselves some time. Right? And in the process, I'm hoping that in some of this work, we can start creating that world that we want to live in right now in those organizing spaces, even in really small ways, like connecting people who are isolated or sharing skills to expand our collective capacities. So, as dire as things are, I hold on to Mariam Kaba's insistence that hope is a discipline. It requires discipline it requires discipline to practice hope every day, especially when every day brings us new horrors. As Kaba tells us, it totally makes sense to feel despair when confronting our reality. And I think it's important to really feel the full weight of that despair, um, probably best with in the community of others. But I think it's important to really be real about how we're feeling about that. But the discipline comes with choosing to act with the knowledge that we can actually change things, even on a small scale, and that we can bring the world we want to see into being through our daily actions. So I'll stop there for now, and then hopefully we can expand more on this in the discussion. I cut a lot of stuff out of the presentation because I wanted to leave a lot of time for discussion. But even as I was going through the slides and going through my notes, I realized that I'm kind of leaving out a lot of stuff for people who don't know as much about immigration. So I'm happy to answer any kind of questions or go wherever the discussion would be most useful for y'all. So thank you so much.